Welcome to 15 Minutes with Longevity. My name is Gisele Wertheim Aymes and I'm your host this evening. Tonight we are talking to Dr Elliott Shevel. He's the founder and director of the Headache Clinic in South Africa, and we're going to be talking about the differences between a headache and a migraine and what they could be saying about your health. Now, Dr Shevel, you are a worldwide expert. I mean, we understand just from doing a bit of research on you. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment in the field, which I think a lot of people just think is a simple field. We all talk about headaches. Often people just use the excuse, I got a headache. It seems like a very common term, not like one of these other illnesses that we hear about. So I was quite interested to know there is a difference between having a headache and having a migraine. What are the differences?
The main difference is that in migraine, one usually has quite a large component of arterial pain from the arteries in the scalp. The ordinary headache is usually thought of as a muscle tension headache. But if the truth be known, it's actually a spectrum. On the one side, pure muscle headache, on the other side, pure arterial headache, but most people fall somewhere in between. So there's no real sharp dividing line between the two.
But you do get different pains in your head, because sometimes
Yes.
you get a pain behind your eyes, and does that give you some indication of the seriousness or the severity of your headache, or not?
Unfortunately not.
Oh.
One can get exactly the same pain and symptoms from muscle pain as one can get from arterial pain. Fortunately, most headaches are not serious. In other words, they're not life-threatening.
When you talk about the muscle and the arterial, is there a difference between the seriousness of those in terms of what an outcome could be?
They just are painful and they destroy one's quality of life.
Okay. So when does this headache become a real problem and something that you should worry about?
Well, it becomes a real problem if it's affecting your quality of life. If you have to take painkillers or headache medication a couple of times a week, or more often than you would like to.
What do you call a painkiller? Sorry, I mean, you're being direct here, but is it like a Disprin, like a normal analgesic you buy at a chemist, versus something that's a bit more scheduled?
The over-the-counter drugs and the scheduled drugs all cause, if you have to take them too often, they all cause a thing called medication overuse headache, which means that they might work in the short term, but in the long term, they make the headache worse and worse and worse and more frequent. So one's stuck between a rock and a hard place. You've got to take something if you have pain. But if you take it too often, there's a good chance it's going to make your condition worse.
But let's talk about you've spoken about muscles and arterial, but is there another source to that? So could you have problems in your liver? Could it be a diet problem? Could it be a stress problem? Could it be even putting your back out doing exercise problem?
Okay, I think what I have to explain is that there's a difference. A lot of these things you mentioned now are triggers.
Okay.
There's a difference between the trigger and the underlying cause. And the best way I've come across of describing this is if one buries a landmine under the ground and you prime it, anything stepping on it will trigger it off. Those are all the triggers.
Okay.
If you take the primer out, nothing will be able to trigger it off anymore. So stress and diet and hormonal changes and all these things are triggers. But if we find the underlying problem and fix that, in other words, we take out your primer, then the triggers don't work anymore. And that's the confusing thing about headaches.
Yes. We do confuse why we get them.
Yes.
So now let's talk about that. How do I get how do I get into the zone of being a person that gets a lot of headaches? Is that a genetic disposition to it? Is it a lifestyle disposition to it? Because some people get them more than others.
Yes. Look, there is definitely a genetic component. If your parents or family members have migraine or headaches, there's a better chance that you're going to get them. But it's only a numbers game. It doesn't mean if your parents never had headaches, you're not going to get them. You've just got a better chance. So there's a genetic component, but it's not a very strong one.
Okay. So then it must be lifestyle related.
We like to think so.
Okay, so let's talk about what lifestyle issues create headaches.
Stress is one of the most important triggers. And the way that stress triggers headaches is if one has a muscle tension problem, which isn't very bad, it's not enough to cause muscle pain, and you then become stressed, the muscles tense up a little bit more. So it crosses the threshold between muscle tension, not enough to have pain, to muscle tension that's painful. And the muscles that are involved are usually the jaw muscles, which attach here to the skull, and the neck muscles.
Okay, now what happens what can we do about that other than medication? There must be other ways that we can treat headaches without popping pills.
Yeah. Well, we don't like medication at all at the headache clinic, and wherever possible we don't use it. The muscle tension is best treated by means of a device that we call a posture modifying appliance. It's a device that one wears in the palate.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's very, very comfortable. It doesn't affect the speech. One doesn't even know it's there.
And you wear this like throughout the day?
Day and night. You just take it out to eat and drink. And what it does is it changes the posture of your jaw, and it changes the posture of your head on the neck, and the muscles relax. And most headache sufferers will do very well just on a posture modifying appliance. That's if they've got a strong muscle tension component.
So it would have to be diagnosed first?
Yes.
And how long do they have to wear such a device?
How long is a piece of string? Some people wear it for a short while, and when the headache goes away, that cycle is broken. Others, 2 years later, if they take it out for a day or two, the headache comes back. So it all depends on the individual. There's so many different factors, some of which we understand and some of which we don't, that we just can't determine beforehand.
Does food play, you've spoken about the muscles, but surely what we eat may also cause us, and I'm not talking about alcohol binges and having hangovers in the morning, which might be associated with headaches. I'm really just talking about food that we might eat.
Well, there are certain very common triggers and certain very uncommon triggers in food. Caffeine can trigger it.
Some people say that chocolate.
Yes. Citrus.
I don't get headaches from
mature
chocolate.
cheeses. Thank goodness.
Yeah, lucky.
But I've come across somebody who gets a headache when they have rooibos tea. Yes. So it's different. And there are obviously chemicals in the foodstuffs, not necessarily manufactured, they're natural chemicals as well, which somehow change the chemistry in either the muscles or the arteries, which are just about there, and it tips the balance. Caffeine is a funny one. I mentioned that certain people get arterial pain. These are the arteries in the skin of the scalp, not in the brain. Okay. And caffeine is a vasoconstrictor. In other words, it closes the arteries down. So if you've got a vascular headache and you drink caffeine, it will help. But if you've got a muscular headache and you drink caffeine, the muscles are going to get less blood supply. It'll make it worse. Good. So in some people, caffeine causes the headache, and some
people
bad.
It's bad. It's really fascinating. I was quite interested that children don't seem to get headaches as much as adults. I might be wrong in that. That's just my personal impression of looking at the family. I mean, I don't have my kids coming to me and saying, "Oh my goodness, I got a headache," but I see that a lot in adults.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, children do get headaches, and little boys and little girls get the same number of headaches. But as soon as maturity starts, as soon as the menstrual cycle starts, the ratio goes 3-to-1. Women get 3 times as many headaches as men.
I was going to ask you that. So women are, so that whole, when a woman says, "I got a headache, leave me alone," it's true.
99% of the time.
Is it? It's true.
It might well be.
Got a headache,
but
darling.
But it might not. Sure.
Okay.
But so
and is that to do with hormones? That
yes.
woman? Okay.
There's that hormonal trigger, which is just a trigger. If we treat the muscles or the arteries, the hormonal trigger no longer works. But that's why there's an increase as you get older.
Someone is suffering from repeated headaches. What advice do you give them, just generally? Okay, what is a repeat? When do you get nervous, and then when do you get treatment, and what should you do, just generally?
Well, if you get repeated headaches, the chances are it's nothing serious. But the first thing to do is have a neurological examination to make sure there's not something inside in the brain that's causing it. As I said before, most headaches are not caused by that, but we've got to check.
Great.
Once we eliminate that, then we have to check all the other structures of the head and neck. We've got to check the muscles, we've got to check the arteries, the joints, the teeth. Sometimes a bad bite can cause muscle imbalance, the sinuses. There's so many structures to check. But as I said, the most common are the muscles and the arteries.
Some people believe that when they've got a headache, they might be suffering from a brain tumor. It sounds, again, quite radical, but I've come across, actually had a staff member once worked for me who had repeated headaches, didn't treat them, and she actually died of a brain tumor, 8 or 9 months later. So again, how do we, for people who are not aware of that, and I was talking about someone who wasn't that conscious about their health, how do we help or guide that in the workplace or in life? How do you know when someone tells you it's a headache, when should you be of help to that person or guide them or give them some advice?
Really, if somebody has headaches, they should have, as I said, a neurological examination. Most of the time it's not going to find the cause, but at least it will eliminate that life-threatening problem. You have to have a proper examination. There are no particular symptoms that perhaps a tumor will give.
Okay. Now, a recent study has shown that there's a link between estrogen that our body gives off and people who suffer from headaches. Can you explain, again, in English, estrogen,
Sure.
What the body gives off? What does that mean?
Sure. First of all, estrogen, during the menstrual cycle, towards the end of the cycle, it drops off, the levels drop. And that's why a lot of women get menstrual headaches. As the hormonal level drops off, estrogen tends to protect the brain. It desensitizes the brain to pain. There's water retention, which can perhaps affect the arteries and the muscles. There's increased stress at that time. But the other part of the estrogen is during pregnancy. When the estrogen levels rise on the second and third trimester, most women with headaches don't have those headaches. And if they continue, once the baby's born, if they breastfeed, they're less likely to get headaches than when the baby goes off the breast.
That's really
So the estrogen is a protective
Yes.
thing, and maybe that's why men are such babies when it comes to pain.
Yeah, because they're not
don't
that
have enough of
resilient
that,
against it,
yes.
of course. So in that circumstance, what is the best thing for a woman to do?
You've got to find your trigger, not the trigger, the underlying cause.
Okay.
You have to examine that patient and find out, is most of the pain coming from the muscles? Is it coming from the
Okay,
arteries?
good.
It's the same thing. It's,
Back through the diagnosis.
one has to have a proper diagnosis.
Now, we always like statistics in the health field. Is there like a killer stat around headaches? How many people in the
Yeah.
population percentage-wise get it?
This is worldwide, and it doesn't matter about culture, whether one lives in a high-rise in New York or in a little village in Africa somewhere. 12% of women get, 12% of people get migraines, 18% women, 6% men. The figures vary, but about 20% of the population gets tension headaches. So we're looking at probably the most common cause of visits to the doctor in any country.
Okay, well, my big takeout, women, we have an excuse to get a headache, that's for sure. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you
Thank
being
you
here
so
with us.
much.
That's it for tonight. Thank you for joining us. And tune in again next week. We'll be discussing epilepsy, the impact it can have on the patient as well as their family. Stay well, be healthy, and I hope to see you here next week for your dose of health news. Good night.